all the podcasts I've been on of varying sizes, I've gotten the most messages, positive feedback, and client referrals from yours. And I've been on podcasts that are probably 5 to 10 times as large in terms of actual reach that like I didn't hear a word after.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to another week with Drew, Alex, and
we got Alec Blenis back on this week. We had a pretty cool chat. We covered a whole bunch of topics, but I think the highlights probably are how to ask better questions when you're trying to learn about fitness stuff. Interference effect is a hot topic. We definitely dove into that one a little bit because it's come up a lot in both of our content. Progressive overload and how it's kind of misunderstood by a lot of people. And then a little bit of a riff, because we're both in the space, on the state of like fitness and social media stuff.
And if the name Alec Blenis sounds familiar to you, we had him on for his own episode last August, actually. So you can scroll back through and listen to that one. We do obviously much more of a deep dive into his background and the work that he's doing. But really one of those guys that is becoming a much bigger name in the fitness space, especially in the hybrid fitness space. And we talked about this a lot when we had him on the first time. We mentioned it a little bit this time as well. Just the Q&As he runs on his Instagram alone are worth the follow, but then just some of the physical feats he's taking on in terms of both the endurance and the strength spectrum are really fun to watch. So a longtime friend of the show. It was fun to have him back on and just kind of talk shop.
I checked it while you were talking there, Drew. His previous episode with us is our number 4 most popular episode ever. So we're hoping this one is awesome too.
Enjoy. On the topic of asking better questions, I don't want to say the worst question either one of you has received because that's insanely broad. But the worst question that was well-intentioned and innocently dumb, if that makes any sense. Does that make any sense?
I think there's a whole category of bad questions that I get. And I think for a question to be good or for you to get a good response, like on my weekly Q&A, your question has to be appropriately specific. Like you can't ask too broad of a question or it's just unanswerable. But then other people would be like, you know, I'm a 32-year-old single dad training 40 minutes a day, and I currently run a 22:35 5K. How do I get better? It's like none of those details were really helpful to me in the way that you think they probably were. So I think when people get overly specific in ways that like are not tremendously helpful, that definitely makes a bad question. Like there's so many other details they could have provided that would have been more helpful. Or when people just ask extremely broad questions like how to get bigger arms. It's like, well, you just train them.
That was me.
So yeah, those just questions that are inappropriately broad or overly specific, I think are both not going to work very well.
Wait, I want to put a shout out to everyone who's listening to this to just slide into Alex DMs right now and ask how to get bigger arms. And then we can gauge the popularity of this episode by how annoying that becomes for you.
Yeah, I'll throw a couple more categories out there, and God bless these people. Like I wish I could help everyone, but like when I see like a message request, for example, and I'll tap on it, and all of a sudden it's like 6 continuous pages of like scrolling, and it's like someone's entire life story and training history and like every workout they've done in the last 6 months. And I'm like, I don't even have time to read this, you know? I just can't. And I feel bad like responding to those like, hey, thanks for the message. Appreciate the thought and effort you put into it. I think this would be, you're going to get more out of like a paid consult or something like that. If you're looking for free advice on the internet, try to keep it pretty brief and pretty concise.
That's fair. Alex?
similar to Alec, I have like different categories of bad questions. So I don't necessarily want to label one like dumber than others necessarily. Because sometimes the like most frustrating questions I get are actually from people who have put the most thought into something and are like far at, like way into the overthinking territory on the issue. A lot of this is like zone 2 centric. I've gotten one where the guy was like, I was doing zone 2 and I was like over an hour into the session. And then I realized like the plumber was coming earlier than I thought they were. So I had to go like higher intensity for the last 20 minutes of the session. Did I ruin the whole session?
What?
Or I looked at a few different calculators or methods of determining it, and I can't figure out whether my zone 2 has to be below 137 or below 141 or below 135. Like, which one is the right one? I'm like, first off, relax. Like,
All right. I almost got to interrupt there for a second because I've gotten so many questions like this about zone 2 and people thinking they've somehow ruined the zone 2 workout. I think this is a whole conversation I think we could have on this topic of like
That's
people will be like, hey, this happened during my zone 2 workout. Did I ruin it? Or like I stopped for 2 minutes to refill my water bottle. Did I fuck up my session? It's like zone 2 is pretty hard to fuck up, guys. Like stopping for a water break, like throwing in a sprint. If your heart rate went 2 beats too high, like you're totally fine. Just calm down.
I need people to understand that there's not, like, no matter what zone system you use, whether it's 3 zones or 5 zones, or you don't care about zones or whatever, like, regardless, there's no magical line where your body hits like a gear shift and everything changes about what you're doing. Like 100% of it exists on a spectrum. Your gains don't disappear. You don't ruin anything when you switch. Like, it's all frameworks we come up with to help structure training, and your body doesn't know about those frameworks, and it's going to be okay.
zone 2 is a
I
state
think
of
people
mind.
hear these people hear these terms like threshold, like ventilatory threshold 1, your VT1, your VT2, and we talk about them being inflection points in terms of like underlying metabolism and that kind of thing. So I think people do on one hand understand there is some element of a continuum or a spectrum, but they think that there's some sort of like kill switch for aerobic adaptation of like if you pass this threshold that something drastically has changed. And I think especially with VT1, when you look at kind of the underlying metabolism and what is changing, some of the changes that happen around VT1, like say you pass the crossover point from like predominantly fat metabolism to more aerobic glycolysis, people think that that's a bigger deal than it is. Like whether you're at 60-40 fat and carb burn versus 40-60, like in terms of what's actually happening on a adaptive level, like what's happening to your mitochondria and that kind of stuff, it's still not really that different. Like there's a lot of ambiguity in how we define some of these crossover points. And especially if you actually test someone in the lab and look at some of these so-called thresholds, they're really fuzzy. Like there's not a lot of like really steep curves or dramatic inflection points if you look at like real raw data. Like when you look at a textbook and you see kind of how people have drawn fit lines and that kind of stuff, you're like, oh yeah, that's a threshold. But you look at some like real data in the lab and you're like, I don't really, there's not much of a threshold going on here. I don't know. I'm just going to kind of like throw one here and call it good.
And that doesn't even touch on labs using slightly different protocols for how they test it, like when they're checking, how often they're checking, what device they're using to check. Like every single one of those things adds in extra amounts of fuzziness that nobody ever talks about when you get to the textbook.
Oh God, yeah. Like so many of the tests are like they're fairly short ramp protocols, right? So like someone's RQ data is going to look dramatically different in the middle of a 2-hour workout than it is 12 minutes into a ramp test. And like, as you said, that makes the thresholds even tougher to define. So I think getting overly worked up in that is a bit silly.
I've pointed to your stuff a few times because you've done a good job talking about like making the point that heart rate is a proxy. Like cardio is not raising heart rate. Heart rate is a proxy for things that are happening other than heart rate. And there's a lot of things that can influence heart rate that aren't the cardio you're doing. So like a weightlifting session where your heart rate goes up does not necessarily mean you're doing cardio. Different temperatures during the same intensity workout could change your heart rate without technically changing the intensity of the workout. Like a million other factors it's a pretty decent proxy, but it's still just a proxy, and getting overly caught up in it. Like, as
Yeah.
I talk about my learning process in this game all the time. And for a while there, I was like super into heart rate and would like be looking at my watch every like 10 seconds during my workouts and like worrying about it way too much. And I'm like, I'm weaning
Yeah.
myself off of like wearing the heart rate monitor or worrying about it, like going for runs, or like maybe I'll track the heart rate, but I won't look at it until after the workout, or like realizing
Yeah.
that it's just an estimate, and like freaking out about it will hurt the workout more than tracking it helped.
Well, I've had guys like, and I legitimately had to tell one of my athletes, not like you just mentioned, wait till the end of your session to look at your heart rate, because what happens is you're looking down at your watch, which creates like, a psychological inflection in your heart rate, but then also it changes the way you breathe. And I'm like looking at my watch as I'm saying this. It changes the way you breathe while you're running, which, affects your heart rate. Not to mention the fact that some people don't even, I mean, they're just using wrist-based heart rate, which is not even like, don't even waste your time at that point. So
Yeah.
I put the blame on like YMCA's / insert any big Globo gym, and just slap a picture on the wall of your heart rate zones. I mean, it's all too easy to fall into this trap of thinking like, oh man, when I go from 135 to 136, like now I'm in zone, 2A versus 2B, and what's happening to my body. I mean, I get where it comes from, but it is definitely an interesting question that comes up all the time.
I don't know if it's a rise in the popularity of it, or if I've kind of stumbled my way into this crowd on social media, but I've been getting more questions lately about the cardiovascular response to like jujitsu, sparring, boxing, stuff in that category. So I was digging into it a little bit, looking at some of the research, and I came across an interesting study comparing simulated sparring to actual sparring, and they measured heart rate response, but also like gas exchange and actual oxygen utilization. And it was really, really interesting seeing the difference between the heart rate response, simulated sparring versus actual sparring, because the actual oxygen demand, kind of metabolic demand of the two was quite comparable, but heart rate was dramatically higher in the situation where you might actually get punched in the face. So it was an interesting, example or testament to the fact that just the stress or the psychological factors surrounding a workout can dramatically change your heart rate. Obviously, that's an extreme example, sparring versus simulated sparring, but you can also talk about on the smaller scale, like, are you running on a treadmill in a gym in a very safe, safe air conditioned environment, or are you out running in your city where you have to stay aware of your surroundings and not get hit by cars and all that kind of stuff? That can affect your heart rate, enough that it might put you a few beats higher than usual. And does that mean that you need to slow down, or that your zone 2 session is ruined because you had a little anxiety about traffic or something? No, it's just not that big of a deal.
Let me ask you this. And I think we may have touched on this the first time we had John, but when you program, we'll call this in quotations zone 2, what does that look like? Because I have my, tips and tricks that I can mention too, but I'm curious how for you, what that looks like.
I think there's no one size fits all, or like, even because everyone interprets things differently, right? Like, you could put an RPE on it, you could put instructions on it, and people all kind of interpret that differently, especially depending on the type of athlete that they are. Like, some people, you tell them like, hey, zone 2 should feel easy. Use that word, and then they're out there, like about to die, and they're like convincing themselves that it was easy. Where you have other people that will just kind of take a walk with a dog or something, stop and take pictures, and you're like, well, you told me to take it easy. And it's like, well, it's not exactly what I had in mind.
Not that easy.
So I I think the key is just like, talk to the person. Like, don't try to program zone 2 in like a couple lines of text. Like, have a conversation and say, hey, we're going to be doing some zone 2 work. Let's have a conversation about what that means, how you can adjust that, auto regulate that. Let's define it, with a conversation rather than a line in your program. And I think that's a lot easier, because then they'll have the opportunity to ask questions, blah, blah, blah. You can really get into the details a little bit, not to make it more complicated, but to kind of put them at ease in a sense, so that they have a lot of clarity about what it's supposed to be. Because before I started doing that, I would end up with a lot of questions, right? and people like over analyzing their zone two work, like, hey, my heart rate was this or this, and do you think this is too fast? People constantly second guessing themselves. So I think just having that conversation, letting people know, hey, there's a lot of room here, kind of for error, a little bit too fast, a little bit too slow. Let's just kind of set some upper and lower bounds on it. Again, yeah, I think the conversation is the best way to do it.
Yeah. For me, again, it kind of, like you mentioned, depends on the type of person. Because I do have some folks, and maybe this is just a military thing where they're very type A and they need numbers. And okay, fine. Like, I know the 180 minus age formula isn't the most accurate thing in the world, but cool, it gives us a number. Nose breathing is another one that people, see all the time. One that I stole from you was the what is it, 12 or 15 word kind of talk test, and use that. I tend to do that for folks that are a little bit more, or a little bit less, I should say, hung up on the numbers and just want kind of a subjective feeling. RPE is a weird one for me because it's always a question of like, okay, do we look at it in the moment or do we look at it at the end and kind of cumulatively, how did this session feel? Way more success with RPE doing like strength training type stuff.
I'm a big fan of breathing rhythms. I picked this one up from Nicodemus or Ultrademus. But Nick is a fantastic ultra runner. He was the 13th finisher of the Barkley Ultra Marathons, and he kind of turned me on to the idea of respiration rhythms with running and using that to kind of gauge intensity. And I've had great success with it ever since. I think I've been doing it for probably, I don't know, 5-6 years now since he kind of introduced me to the idea. And basically the idea is that your ventilatory threshold, that kind of inflection point in your respiratory rhythm is when there's kind of a disproportionate increase in respiratory rate compared to intensity. So that point where your breathing is pretty steady, you go any faster and suddenly it gets a lot faster. When you run, your breathing rhythm is going to kind of naturally sync up with your stride rates. You might inhale for 3 or 4 steps and exhale for 3 or 4 steps. Find kind of a rhythm that you can settle into. It might be different for everyone, but for most people, if you start out at a pretty comfortable jog, you'll probably be in that ballpark of like 3 to 4 steps on an inhale, 3 to 4 steps on an exhale. So 6 to 8 steps per breath cycle. And you can generally speed up quite a bit and keep that same rhythm. There's going to be a point where you have to go from like a 6 to 8 step rhythm to a 4 to 6 step rhythm. And that represents a pretty dramatic shift in respiratory frequency that tends to line up pretty well with that VT1 for most people. So it's a pretty easy one that you can take with you anywhere. Find that comfortable breathing rhythm, link it with your stride rate, and you can use that as a way to kind of figure out where your VT1 is. I use that with a large percentage of my athletes, especially those who aren't as comfortable with just the RPE or totally by feel, and they want some sort of way to quantify it.
Mm-hmm.
I do, since we've already spent a bunch of time on zone 2. I don't want to spend the whole episode on it, but there was something Alec posted about, I think a few weeks ago, that I thought was valuable. And it brings up a conversation we've had on the podcast before, but I don't think we had it with Alec last time he was on here, which is the whole zone 2 or polarized thing might not be relevant if you're not doing like a certain minimum amount of like weekly cardio volume in the first place, or like I think one of the biggest advantages here is that it like frees up recovery capacity for other training that you need to do, and you still get some great metabolic effect and stuff. But if you got somebody who's like not training hard or not training consistently in the first place, it just becomes an excuse to like not train hard more. And that's not the way we want to go, right? So like I'm gonna pull it up because I want to get your wording on it right. But like we've over optimized on this stuff, and like the wrong people are hearing it. So your example was whether a competitive cyclist does their 20 hours of weekly low intensity rides at 65 or 70% might make a huge difference for them. Whether you do your 20 minutes of weekly cardio at 65 or 70% probably doesn't matter for you, and trying harder would probably be better. Right. And I worry a lot because I see people like, I'll see like an ACFT scorecard where their 2-mile time was like 18 minutes, and they're asking questions about polarized training. I'm like,
bro,
probably just running hard is going to be fine for you. Like, I don't think you need to worry about it that much. It's okay.
Yeah. When you have someone that's doing like 2 hours of weekly cardio on the like 80-20 train, I'm like, in other words, you just don't train hard at all. Like you really want to fill up your high intensity bucket first. Like I'm as big of an advocate for zone 2 as you're going to find, but the low hanging fruit is high intensity work. And if you're not kind of maxing out your capacity for that first, you're missing the point of zone 2 work, because the point of zone 2 work is to provide space for high intensity. So if you're not getting that high intensity piece first, you're doing zone 2 work for all the wrong reasons.
And I think this is a key point, because this goes beyond just like zone 2 or polarized or running training or whatever. And it gets into the hybrid conversation, which is what you've kind of zoned in on with your platform. And it's that part of hybrid training means carefully balancing the amount of stress you can tolerate in a week and continue to adapt from, which means being smart about the dosing and being smart about the intensity and all that stuff. But I think sometimes people look at like certain athletes who are doing that kind of stuff and say, I need to train like that person, when they forget that they're not training at even a fraction of that person's volume or intensity in the first place. And all those factors might not even be relevant. And that's a hard conversation to have sometimes. And you got to figure out who you're talking to and what kind of level they're on already. And
dude, hybrid is the new hotness, man. I mean, I blame Alec to an extent, but like hybrid people, like everybody's trying to be hybrid capital H, which is funny because like really that's just good training. I mean, you're doing a little bit of everything and being pretty proficient at it. I don't know what you guys' opinions on that would be, but that's kind of where I sit.
Yeah, I think that with the rise in kind of popularity of it, and people are seeing kind of what's possible, it's another case. We've seen this in single sport kind of training programs too, is everyone wants to train like an advanced athlete. Most people aren't an advanced athlete. So they look at like the training programs of what some top athletes are doing and they try to emulate that, which if you're in a single sport, you can, I don't want to say get away with it, but it's not going to be as devastating. But if you take like a top CrossFit athletes training program or, other top hybrid athletes training program, and you try to do that, and you're not ready for it, you will get completely destroyed. Like these can be very, very demanding programs when you account for like the training volume and the training intensity. Like you have, a lot of difficulty on both sides. So I think most people need to really, really scale back and set more realistic expectations in terms of, what they can handle starting out and how long it's going to take to build to that level.
The phrase I always go to whenever I end up having this conversation is, so people look at like the athlete they want to be and think they need to train like that person is currently training. But in reality, you need to train like that person was training when they were at the fitness level you are currently at. Yeah. And the awkward part of that is that the time in their life when they were at the fitness level you are currently at might be when they were 14. And it's kind of hard because they might have specialized really early and have a ton of genetic advantages and like had that capacity at that point and they were able to do it. But even if it was when they were in college or something, like you don't know what they were doing then, and it's probably a lot less sexy than what they're doing now. And that's what you need. And it's boring, and it's building a base of tolerance so that they could do all that cool stuff like years down the road.
That's so true. Like even a lot of like athletes that have changed sports, for example, like hybrid athletes that have like a strong just weightlifting background or strong endurance training background, like from 10, 20 years ago or childhood, like that's the stuff that you don't see. And it's like no one's trying to hide anything, right? But you're not like putting all these disclaimers on every Instagram post of like, by the way, make sure you keep in mind, the fact that, I was this type of athlete 20 years ago when you're reading my training program, whatever. But it is important to keep in mind.
Well, it doesn't help that those people generally are also selling their training program, and they're selling it under the banner of like, follow along with what I'm like, here's my prep for the whatever games, like do the thing. And then people try it and they're like, this is really freaking hard. But it's, day by day, here's what I did. This is probably too an interesting or an appropriate time to just throw a grenade into the conversation, and we can talk about interference effect, because we're talking about hybrid training. And then of course, people, we talked about 80-20, people just generally using that as an excuse not to train very hard at all. I would argue that the interference effect conversation kind of falls into that same conversation. Go.
I got a tiny internet debate last night that started, like, obviously I posted a thing about the interference effect, and like obviously my overall stance is the same as most people's overall stance, which is most of the people who are worried about the interference effect probably don't need to be. But like somebody commented saying the interference effect doesn't exist. And that mostly ends up becoming a semantics conversation about like what counts as the interference effect. Like if you get tired doing one thing and then don't do as good at another thing, is that interference, or are you just tired from doing a thing? And the same thing works on the macro level of like, did you just like use up all your capacity to tolerate volume on one modality in a week or whatever, so you didn't get as much out of the other modality? All of that could be called interference effect. And even with like a more conservative definition of interference effect, where you're looking at sessions that are separated by several hours and you're within like a volume that the athlete can tolerate, there still is evidence that it exists between like certain modalities of endurance training and like explosive power kind of stuff, especially in trained athletes. So I think you'll hear a lot of people be like, the interference effect doesn't actually exist. Like, look at all this other research. But like there's a sufficient body of research, and depending on your definition, I think it's a pretty defensible statement to say the interference effect does exist, but it becomes a question of, does it matter in the context of where you currently are and what you're currently training for? And for most people, I think it's probably irrelevant. And when I say most people, I mean anybody who's not a hyper specialized athlete.
For sure. I think an interesting analogy that I made on like a previous post was we can call this thing the interference effect. We can use that in other contexts. Like, for example, if you want to improve your squat, we could talk about the value of say deadlifting. Like, is there an interference effect from deadlifting if your primary goal is squatting? And depending on kind of what level you're at, how you program, are you deadlifting before you squat? Are you deadlifting after you squat? Are you a beginner? Are you an advanced? Are you a squat specialist? Whatever. We may see varying levels of kind of carryover or transference from, hey, if you get better at deadlifting and incorporate that in your program too, that might actually help you be a better squatter. You know, if you're, say, like a novice lifter, like you're just kind of learning the ropes, you might want to squat and deadlift, even if your goal is just to be good at squatting long term. Whereas if you're like an advanced squat specialist trying to set a world record, you probably don't want to be wasting your energy trying to build up your deadlift too. You just need to squat, right? So I think we can make the same kind of point with cardiovascular training of, if you're a beginner, there's probably more of a, transference than there is an interference. And the better and better you get, the more that is going to shift towards interference. But it doesn't have to be the special conversation of, it being cardio. It's just using your energy in a different way. I think if we were to truly be able to call it interference versus just using your energy and stuff in a different way than what your primary goal is, we would need to see strong evidence that it directly inhibited or caused the opposite adaptation of what we were trying to achieve. I think that'd be a more clear way to define interference. And I think the evidence for that is fairly weak. So yes, the interference effect is real. It's a semantic conversation in terms of like, how do you define it? But I think if we consider it, in the context of any other training variable and how we'd spend our energy on any other type of training, I don't think it's all that special.
Yeah, even if you dig into any of the interference effect research, most of them end up providing like guidelines for how to set up the way you train in a way that maximizes all of the results you're trying to get. And that's the useful output of the conversation. Like, whether or not the interference effect exists, whether or not you care about it, whatever your goal is, there's some ways you can be smart about how you order your training, how much time between different types of training, how much of each type of training. Like, that's the useful stuff that I think comes out of an interference effect conversation, is just foundational kind of program.
Well, I don't know.
Schedule.
I would push back on that only to say that, for me at least, growing up, I say growing up as a strength coach, like, and getting into concurrent training, like, that made it more confusing, because you'll read one, paper, article, whatever, and it's like, oh, do your lifting before you're running. And then you read another one and it says, do your running before you're lifting. And then it's space it out 6 hours. No. It should be 8 hours. No, it should be 3 hours. I think I get what you're saying. I think that, yes, there is certainly some foundational principles you can put in place to do the kind of adaptation currency, management that we talk about. For me, it's like, and I'd be curious to see y'all's thoughts on this, but it's like, what's your primary thing? Is it the endurance side of the spectrum, or is it the strength side of the spectrum? Do that first when you're fresher. I think everybody can kind of understand the why behind that. Space things out in such a way that by the time you get to do the second one, you're not still smoked from the first one. Although the caveat there for me is I have had some success with guys where, like, we'll do a heavy lower body session, and as the finisher, we'll do some speed work because we just kind of compile all the stressors into one place, and then they recover from that throughout the rest of the week. So like, even when you do have foundational principles, you can still make some tweaks. But the concurrent hybrid interference, whatever body of literature you want to call it, like, it's, take it for what it is. But at the same time, like, most of the training programs that they're putting those folks through don't really make sense in the first place. Most of the findings that they publish don't really make sense in the first place. And then almost, I think, especially if you're a young coach or like an athlete who's just kind of getting into reading this type of thing, like, it can become a little bit prohibitive / intimidating because you just introduce a whole new set of puzzle pieces into the equation. And it's like, well, holy shit, how do I do any of this at all? Screw it. I'm just going to go back to adding 5 pounds to my squat every single week until I run into a wall. That's me getting off my soapbox now, though. Sorry, Alex, I'm just pushing back on your point.
Yeah, there's so many different variables that we can try to optimize for. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from with like different guidelines with like, no, you want to consolidate stressors, or no, you want the 3 or 6 or 8 hours between, or do this first and that first. And I think that is a matter of like, are we optimizing for mTOR versus AMPK pathway activation versus are we optimizing for, practicality and logistics versus optimizing what's fun and enjoyable versus optimizing how you feel going into the session and like how much time are you going to have to spend warming up, and that kind of thing. Like when you separate sessions, if you lift heavy in the morning and then you go back out for speed work in the afternoon, like that's a lot more warm up time that you're going to have to do again to get ready for your speed work. Whereas if you had just done them back to back, you're pretty much already ready to go. So there's a lot of factors like that are often not accounted for in discussions of like metabolic pathways and that kind of thing, which is a very real kind of practical consideration. So these are all things we need to think about. But at the end of the day, like kind of the rule of thumb, or the heuristic to work with is what allows you to work at the quality or the intensity and the volume that you need to have a good workout. Like if you're showing up for speed work and you're super sore and you feel like shit, that probably just wasn't a good idea. Even if you did say separate the sessions by 8 hours, you show up to the track that night and your like legs are starting to tighten up. Well, that's probably not a good setup for you. You might have should have done that speed work earlier while you were still warm, still loose before you tightened up. But that could be different for everyone, and it's going to be highly dependent on, the finer details of your training. How much volume are you doing on squats? Are you doing novel exercises that day that are going to lead to some soreness, or are you doing more practice exercises? There's so many like small variables that I don't think we're necessarily ever going to be able to have one firm set of rules of this is how you combine strength and cardio. It's more of a factor of like what variables are significant for you this week. For this week, the significant variables to manage might be, DOMs from variety. This week, the significant variables might be the fact that you have a super busy work week and we just need to figure out how to get as much work done in the time that you have, which probably means stacking sessions so you're not spending extra time warming up and traveling to and from the gym more than necessary. So I think week to week, person to person, situation to situation, there's going to be different variables that we have to prioritize. So I think in terms of the interference effect discussion, I think trying to figure out, best practices for concurrent training is, in a sense, a losing battle. I think it's good to know like what effects different kind of protocols have, but I don't think there's ever going to be one best approach for how to do it.
This is going to be a little bit of a segue because it goes way beyond just interference effect kind of stuff. But when you start talking about variables, and you're specifically talking about like biophysical variables of like the actual training and the actual effect it's having. And I looked at a study because it got shared on another page. It looks like you've liked this post as well, so you saw it as well. But it was the MacArthur et al. 2014 like CrossFit study, and it was looking at like what gets people to continue training. And I thought it was fascinating because it lays out what variables get people to stick to training, and like the biophysical stuff, like how your body responds, like whether you get injured, how much it benefits you and stuff like that, is the least impactful when you compare it to things like routine, intrinsic motivation, and psychosocial factors.
What's number one?
Number one by far is whether you have like an established routine around it, but that's followed by like, is it fun, and is there social engagement and things like that.
Wait, they
the,
just looked at CrossFitters? Are you looking at the study right now before I ask you a bunch of questions about it?
I have like a snip of it. I will try
Okay.
and I'll try and pull the rest of the study up in a second, because they
That's a
only snip
curious
like
question.
one chart. But
Yeah.
there's some really, like, the presence of a dog when you are training.
Oh, dude,
has
for
a
sure.
positive-
Through the roof. Done. I'm in.
Like, it's to be fair, it's not quite through the roof, but it does help.
What
but,
about
like,
cats are lower on the list?
Cat did not appear on.
Gym
I think
cat?
cats just leave while you're working out. I think they get annoyed by the presence of your raucousness and go away.
Oh man.
But like, it's just interesting to see, because like they acknowledge in it, there's little to no scientific evidence whatsoever that CrossFit is any better than anything else at improving anything, right? Like, it's just not that optimal, and that's fine. It doesn't matter that it's not that optimal.
People are more
because
compliant.
it takes care. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
Like, and so like maybe people, like, this is like missing forest for the trees kind of stuff, right? Like, where people are getting like super dialed in on like metabolic variables or whatever, like picking the exact exercise they need to do, or optimal form, or like the number of times I've seen debates about conventional versus sumo deadlift, whatever. Like we get really wrapped up in things.
If you debate
just,
about
don't
that,
matter.
If that triggers you, don't go to Alec's page, because Alec is over here doing single leg deficit, one arm, eyes closed, blindfolded, sumo deadlift, whatever the hell, and you might get triggered by that too.
Oh man, it's funny because I love learning, or the entertainment factor of figuring out like what's optimal, and learning some of the science, especially with regards to concurrent training. It's fascinating. And in my own training, in my own life, and I'll be the first to admit that, outside of training, I have a pretty easygoing life, right? Like I don't work as much as a lot of people. I don't have kids. I don't have a lot of the stress that a lot of real people do. But still, finding the time to do the training I want to do can be a pain in the ass sometimes. Like, I don't always have the ability to set up my sessions exactly the way I want. I might get interrupted mid workout and have to hop on a conference call or something for an hour and like pick up the second half of my workout later. All sorts of things like that just are constantly disrupting, whatever optimal flow that I would like to have for myself. So I used to, many years ago, always try to force myself to do the optimal thing. Like, well, if I have to wake up at 4 a.m. to be able to get these workouts done in the right order, then so be it. I'll make it work. But the more and more I learn, and the more and more I experience, the more I realize that just programming the sessions in the way that is the least stressful for me, 9 times out of 10 gives me the best workouts. Like, when am I going to be able to do this workout and it not be a pain in the butt? That 9 times out of 10 is the most important consideration for me. And that's coming from someone who, I'd like to think I'm relatively competent in each of these areas, cardio and strength. And sometimes I'll, like, just the other day, I did a CrossFit class. I did a CrossFit Metcon before my main strength work for the day, just because it sounded like fun. Class was happening. I'm like, fuck it, I'll hop in the Metcon. I'll do my strength afterwards. And I genuinely prioritize variables like that over, these theoretical optimal constructs.
I think chasing the optimal thing, whatever, quote unquote, creates so much stress for so many people that it then becomes unoptimal, which is, I don't even know if that's a word, less optimal.
So,
I think
suboptimal.
suboptimal.
Yeah, damn it, suboptimal. I would say edit that out, but I know you won't. It creates a suboptimal training environment, because I was the same way. I was just this past week having a conversation with a friend of mine about John Kiley, who we had on forever ago, because I would, again, growing up as a strength coach, I would read his stuff and I thought, man, this is really profound. Like, this is excellent. But like, what does it mean for, like, how do I program this in? Like, how do I take all these high level thoughts and like, what does that mean for sets and reps on the squat and the bench and for running, blah, 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 blah. And you kind of arrive at this inflection point of like, it doesn't matter. Like the movements you choose don't matter unless, again, you're training to be a powerlifter or you're competing in the Olympics or you're football, then the movements matter. But for most folks, it really doesn't matter all that much if you front squat or back squat, or if you run Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning. And like to take it even a step further, and people will call this like, flexible periodization or what have you, but this idea of like, hey, as your coach, I'm gonna program this week, but if you need to move Wednesday to Friday because you stayed up late on Tuesday, or you just don't want to do Thursday on Thursday and that becomes Monday, like it really doesn't matter. It's only when it becomes a recurring pattern that we have a conversation of like, hey man, do you want me to just put your run earlier in the week, or do you want me to, because it seems like it's not
Yeah.
working out for you. But people get so hung up, like you mentioned, getting up at 4 a.m. to do the thing, or I got to wake up at midnight to eat 6 hard-boiled eggs because that's how you get jacked. Like it just creates and I'll
Yeah.
use you guys' word, suboptimal training environment.
So I think that one of the things at the root of this kind of quest for optimal and this idea that everything has to be perfect is a fundamental misunderstanding of progressive overload.
Oh, yes. Yes, let's do it.
I think that's a conversation worth having. So this idea of progressive overload, like if I do, X lift with 100 pounds this week, I think a lot of people think that progressive overload means that I at least, do one more rep next week or lift 101 pounds instead of 100. Like there's got to be some sort of quantifiable progress. And if, my schedule gets messed up or I have to switch my workout order or something and I end up only doing 98 pounds or getting one less rep, if I'm not able to progressively overload the exercise, that I've somehow failed something or I haven't gotten, an adaptation from that workout. And I think that's extremely wrong, extremely misguided. And I think if we can put people at ease and get them to realize that even if you do lift less weight, or even if you do less reps on the exercise, that doesn't mean that you aren't applying progressive overload, in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't mean that you're not getting an adaptive response from that exercise. There's so many other things that you have to account for to determine, is that, was that workout beneficial for you, other than did you, check the boxes and can you fill in your spreadsheet the way that you were hoping for? So yeah, I think let's dive into kind of progressive overload and what exactly that means.
That is one thing that infuriates me to no end, is when you're sitting in literally any strength and conditioning presentation and Milo in the bowl comes up, and it's usually like the second or third slide, and they're using it as an example of progressive overload. And Alex may have heard me rant about this before, but it's this idea, it's a reverse causality. Like it's the wrong way round. And shout out to Evan Pycon for kind of turning me onto this. But the Milo in the bull story, says, oh, the bull got bigger and bigger, and because he got heavier and heavier and Milo lifted him, he got stronger and stronger. And you flip it on its head. He was able to lift it because he got stronger and stronger. And that, to me, I mean, I can point to very few things that like fundamentally changed the way that I program for athletes. That was one of the things, is this misunderstanding of progressive overload and thinking that you have to add weight, or you have to, if you're doing your 400s at this time, then next week we're going to trim, the week after we're going to trim. It's the idea that, hey, we don't have to change the prescription every single week. You will adapt into it. And when your body is ready to push, add weight or what have you, if we have the right constraints in place, well, here we go. We've gotten stronger. That's progressive. It's progressively adapting into the stimulus, as opposed to just banging your head against the wall by thinking you have to force overload every single week. I love this conversation, but I will go off on a tangent.
I think in the context of, I love everything you've said there. Just the fact that people reverse it and they try to force it instead of just allowing themselves to get stronger and let the workout kind of evolve as a consequence of that. But in the context of concurrent training, I think something that people don't account for is just the role of variables like fatigue. So for example, let's take a squat workout, like, 3 sets of 5 at 315. I don't know. So let's say that's my squat workout, week 1, 2, 3, 4. That doesn't sound like progressive overload. It just sounds like I'm doing the same damn thing every week. But if kind of behind that, if we layer in a cardiovascular program that I'm running 10 miles one week, 12 the next, 14 the next, 16 the next. Now we have, a cardio program that kind of linearly progresses in volume. We have a strength program that's the same thing every week. I think most people would look at that and say, okay, well, you're applying progressive overload to the cardio, but not to the strength. And I would disagree with that. I would say that both of them are being progressively overloaded in the sense that you're now having to do the same squat workout. You're doing the same workload under conditions of greater fatigue. If you can do that squat workout in week 4, despite the accumulating fatigue of all that running catching up with you, that is also progressive overload. It's less obvious. You don't see it if you take it out of context. But I think in the big picture of your overall program, I think that still is indicative of progress. So I think that's another thing that people miss, in the concurrent or hybrid athlete conversation, is that progressive overload, or maybe that's even the wrong word here. Maybe I should just say progress, doesn't always come in the form of more weight or more reps. Sometimes it just comes in the form of you're able to do it in spite of, X, Y, and Z. Whereas before you had to be fresh to do that. And that is a huge step forward. And if we did take that fatigue away, there's probably some underlying progress or underlying adaptation that wouldn't reveal itself performance wise. It's just kind of masked by fatigue. So sometimes this progress is happening kind of under the hood and we don't see it. And we need to think about that in the context of how we think about progressive overload.
The traditional way of thinking about it too also leads to some like pretty weird assumptions if you don't like think about it better. Because like one, and this is something Drew talks about all the time, it requires a coach to predict the future. It requires them to know how much and how fast an individual person is going to adapt to a particular dose of stimulus. And I think pretty much anyone can agree that you don't know. And it's like the way you find out is a trial and error kind of thing, right? Like you titrate to effect, you figure out what dose is appropriate for the person. And like if a doctor is figuring out what dose is appropriate for a person with a medicine, they don't try and predict the future of when they're going to have to change the dose. They wait till they see something change in how the person is responding to change the dose. And like that same kind of thing applies to the stress that a coach would use with an athlete. And it also implies, and this goes back to like the Milo and the Bull thing, but like you hear, if you go on like T Nation articles about progressive overload or wherever you're listening to whatever, it starts talking about forcing adaptation, like forcing muscle growth or forcing strength gains. And it's just such like a nonsense term. Like it doesn't, that's not how it works. That's not what it means. And it's going to like lead people to really stupid training decisions if they think that's what you're supposed to do to your, like the number of headlines I've seen of like, use these 3 exercises to force radical muscle gain. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, it's just completely made up and it doesn't make any sense if you even like briefly think about it.
This might be a hot take, but I think a misunderstanding of progressive overload is the worst attribute of the strength and conditioning industry, and probably the biggest underpinning issue in strength and conditioning. Because if you think about it, what are coaches most often accused of / lose their job for? It's injuring athletes. And sometimes that can happen because of freak accidents, sure. But more often than not, it happens because, like Alex just mentioned, I sit there in my magical office and create a 12-week program that maps out your future like it's some kind of video game. And I take, in some cases, collegiate or professional athletes, which have so many other things going on. And I expect that, 7 Tuesdays from now, you're going to be able to lift this weight. And I have a whole culture built around the fact that you're going to do the thing alongside your teammates. And we're going to see this program through to the end. And because I think progressive overload means forcing adaptation and driving into heavier and heavier weights, when your body can no longer adapt to that and you become injured, that is what ultimately creates these issues in our industry. And I mean, Alex, you mentioned the medical industry where we talk about, how do we titrate out pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. Like other industries have figured this out, this whole kind of human, like working with the human factor. And I don't know why strength and conditioning has its head so far up its ass to think that I can just keep adding weight or trimming time or forcing the athlete to adapt. And when they get injured or they fall off the program, it's their fault. It's not my fault as the coach because I didn't have the wherewithal to critically think through what adaptation really means. And it drives me insane because once you realize what progressive overload is and how to apply it and what it truly means to program for an athlete, you don't have to worry about people getting injured because of something you wrote down 8 weeks from now, because you're not even really planning 8 weeks from now. You just have an idea of where you're going and you let each week inform the next, inform the next, inform the next. And that is how you handle athletes. And if I made a lot of enemies just then, I apologize.
Just a brief aside, if you look at some of the research, because Drew mentioned collegiate athletes specifically, there's pretty solid research on like different things that like correlate with injury risk among collegiate athletes. And some of the biggest ones are like breaking up with a significant other, or like when finals are. Like,
well, if she smacks you in the kneecaps with a hammer, then like that's one thing.
But there's so many things that the coach cannot possibly predict that influence how prepared a person is to train on any given day and what performance they're going to get during that training. And like thinking which week to add 5 pounds, I don't know. It just seems
you're wrong.
Wild.
You're blatantly wrong. Like you are wrong.
Yeah. I think another kind of issue or potentially a reason why this happens is a lot of coaches just fall back on the deload of let's just throw more at them until they overreach and until they need a deload. And that makes your job very simple, very easy of like, let's just keep adding more until you die. We'll give you a deload and start over. And I think that is a very simple approach, but it takes away the thoughtfulness that's required to actually give someone an optimal dose. They can just kind of do whatever, throw more at it until, you can kind of repeat the cycle. But I think it takes a lot more effort to try to stay in the sweet spot and give someone a good program week after week after week, instead of being able to kind of undershoot and then throw more at them until they die and say, oh, time for a break.
Here's a question for you. Do you program deloads?
Probably only for 5% of my athletes. And it's because they love that style. So if someone enjoys it, if they have fun with it, and if they say like, basically they need that format psychologically to kind of have that built-in off week or lighter week every so often. If someone really thrives with that and that's what they want, I think it can work really well. I think that there's so many like baked in assumptions in strength and conditioning that people think that that's like by default the way you're supposed to program or the best way to program. And I think so many of those assumptions, like there's just nothing backing it up or nothing supporting it. So yeah, for like 90+% of my athletes, I don't program deloads at all. I wait until they either need them or they happen organically. And then probably got a handful of people who just say that they really, really like that psychologically.
Alec just backed his way into an important point, which is that we talked about optimal earlier, and it turns out like what optimal is just whatever like an individual person likes enough to keep doing for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I was going to say, I have found myself programming, and I don't even call them deload, just like an off week, whatever. But generally it comes off the back of like a psychological trigger versus a performance trigger. What I mean by that is if I have an athlete, and all of my athletes do this, they leave kind of copious notes on their sessions because I ask them to. But generally you can read between the lines and get a sense of like, man, they seem pretty either bored or tired, or they have a lot going on or whatever. That tends to be for me what triggers, hey, let's change things up next week and kind of back off a little bit, versus week 1, we're going to do 80%, week 2, 85, week 3, 90, and then week 4, back to 70. But then the week after that, we're going 99. I've moved away from all of that. And I think especially, maybe this was a lesson learned in kind of the tactical space, but like for this population, because of how chaotic everything else is, you end up with these kind of natural deloads just by virtue of people not being able to hit all of the sessions. So if you do then just randomly decide to throw in a deload week because you think you're supposed to, you could be missing valuable training time just because you think that you have to do this thing because that's what strength and conditioning tells you have to do.
So I'll play devil's advocate here slightly and kind of talk about a few cases where I think it can be useful outside of some of the contexts we've talked about so far. And that's in the context of certain competitions. I think proper preparation for certain events requires training that is not sustainable. So if I have someone that's training for a marathon, for example, if I want to get them exposure to a 22-mile long run, whatever, that's probably going to be a pretty demanding workout for them, and probably not something that they can turn around from and jump right back into a normal training day the next day. So in cases like that, there may be some sort of built-in structure, whether you want to call it a deload or not, of kind of oscillatory volume or intensity or whatever of we're intentionally giving you a workout that will require you to overreach a little bit, followed by several workouts in a row that it's a deload, it's a back off, it's easier workouts, whatever. I think that's valid and valuable. Same thing if you're prepping someone for like a powerlifting competition or something, and they need to get used to lifting RPE 10 singles. You might, especially if it's someone that's never competed before, you might want to get them some of that exposure, build some confidence at workloads that might require them to back off a little bit, just to build familiarity with what they're going to have to do in competition. So I don't know if you want to call that a deload or not, but I think there are times when you do want to push the envelope a little bit and account for that and how you adjust subsequent training intensity.
Well, and as well, I mean, you mentioned keeping your squat session the same and increasing, mileage or volume. Like there's ways where you can peel back some of the additional stressors. If, the example here would be like you have a road race coming up. So yeah, we'll peel back the squat fatigue a little bit, and that will expose some performance gains that might have been hiding for the past couple of weeks because we had all this other stuff going on. I mean, is that a deload, or is that just, again, you responding to kind of what the athlete is signaling to you alongside the calendar that you have this event coming up? So surely we're going to make some changes to the training to accommodate for that. I like the word that you used, oscillatory. Maybe we just call this like oscillatory periodization and sell a book about it. I think that's probably the move.
I like it a lot. Yeah, I've used all sorts of whether you call it oscillatory or I program what I call just alternating long runs for people quite a bit, where we kind of alternate between a long run that kind of pushes their limits a little bit and one that kind of backs off and just kind of maintains their ability. Sometimes we'll kind of step up the volume for like 3 weeks, like 3 weeks up, 1 week down, which kind of lines up well with like the classic build and deload structure. But you can do that with individual workouts too. So I might have, their strength training program doesn't necessarily change a whole lot week to week to week. We might have a long run that increases in week 1, 2, and 3 and backs off in week 4 and kind of repeats. So you can have some of these like classic structures layered or built into your program, even if it doesn't apply to the whole program across the board.
So I know we're coming up on the hour mark here, and we don't want to take a whole bunch of your time, but one, and this is probably a real brief conversation, but something I've noticed you've dialed in well recently, frankly, that I'm a little bit jealous of, is figuring out how to like
big biceps.
It's not how to get bigger arms, I'm sorry, but it's figuring out what topics people are worked up about in the fitness space, and then like delivering messages that resonate about those topics. And you're not the only one who's like pretty much gone all in on the like white text, black background content of just like, here's my thoughts, let's go.
Yeah.
But like, I'm curious about like, is there a process you have for like when you figure out like what message people need to hear or what the right time is to say it? Or is it just like something that you've been hearing in conversation a lot recently that you want to like hammer home?
And I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that there's no process, and I don't read a lot of content. So I don't necessarily know not that I don't read any content at all, but like, I don't know. I don't follow that many people. I'm trying to follow more people. I'm trying to like stay engaged in more conversations. But like the more time I spend on Instagram, the angrier I get at the fitness industry generally. So I try to keep it to a minimum at least. But one strategy that I found helpful is kind of using my stories as a testing space. So one, the Q&As, it lets me know what are people asking questions about. I can post, short ideas or question responses or memes or whatever, like whatever I post in my story, I see how people respond. And sometimes I'm surprised that like something I'll share in my story, I'll get like 30 replies to. And I'm like, I didn't know this was an interesting topic to people. Like, I didn't think people were going to respond to this. Or I'll respond to a question with something I think is like a hot take or interesting. And like, I don't get any hearts or replies. I'm like, well, I guess people don't give a shit about that. So that kind of clues me in as to what I might want to post about next. So I find just like using your story as a way to connect with your audience and like see what they want, that can be really good inspiration for your future posts. And two, one of my posts, like for example, today, the first slide of my post today was from something I posted like 6 months ago, but I came at the rest of the post from a different angle. So like I used the same opening slide, which I knew was an attention grabber. It worked well in the previous post, but I kind of answered that question in a totally different way than I did on the original post. So you can use things that were successful for you in the past or things that people enjoyed engaging with you about and continue to revisit them without necessarily having to post the exact same thing again.
The part I struggle with the most is that I sort of know what people respond to really well on my content, and it's not important stuff. And that's the part that hurts me is that like
Oh yeah.
if I wanted to like maximize audience size and engagement numbers, it would be like gaming army policy nonsense. Like just stupid stuff surrounding like nuances of like army bullshit, to be honest. Like that's what my audience loves. But I do think this is going to be nerdy for a second, but I take like a Mops and Mo's approach to Mops and Mo's, which is that like measures of performance for the page are the size of the audience, the amount of engagement, all that kind of stuff. But the measures of effectiveness for the page is like, is the audience engaged and is it making a difference in real life? So if I had like half as many followers and half as many engagements, but twice as many people were like healthier and fitter and getting good results and like employing it in their jobs and stuff like that, that would be success for me. And so this is something you've said to me before, Alec, that I thought was really, really cool, was that like the audience on this platform kind of outkicks its coverage in terms of actual engagement with things, like actually reaching out and talking to people, actually like employing the things we talk about on the platform. So that's like, it's frustrating because social media will like take you down a black hole of like, and the other thing I've learned is that the best way to get really, really good engagement on social media is just to post something that is objectively wrong, because it will attract people that are there to correct you and fight about it. And that drives your numbers through the roof. So like social media does not reward like accuracy or value in any sense.
What?
At least in the short term. So like there's a whole game out there that's super, super frustrating.
Something that I kind of stumbled upon only recently, I think, because there's topics that I want to talk about that like I think people need to know this, or at least I want to talk about it, but I know that if I post this as white text on black background, nobody's going to read it. So I think that I'm saving my like kind of hot takes, right? Saving the more controversial information. I'm posting those as just the text in a black background, whereas things that are a little bit more personal, or maybe there's not like a clickbait headline to go with it, I need the photo or the video to be the attention grabber. So I post me doing some stupid lift and talk about the interesting topic that I want to talk about, and I rely on that kind of being the hook. And then if something is truly controversial or whatever, I can let that stand on its own as text. So that's something I've been playing around with a little bit more recently. Seems to be going okay. But yeah, I've been really proud and thankful for my audience. I feel like they engage super well, and certainly you guys, your audience as well. I was telling Drew before you hopped on to record that of all the podcasts I've been on of varying sizes, I've gotten the most messages, positive feedback, and client referrals from yours. And I've been on podcasts that are probably 5 to 10 times as large in terms of actual reach that like I didn't hear a word after. So fantastic work, you guys.
What is your hottest take?
My hottest take?
Yeah. What are you sitting on? What are you sitting on right now? That's just the hotness. This is a closing question, Alec. Don't let us down.
I got thinking about it today. I posted about it before, and I saw another post today that triggered me. But I think the single most overrated exercise in all of fitness is farmer's carries.
Woo.
That's my hot take.
Sizzle. Do you want to say
It's a
why?
good one.
You have a 30
That's a
here,
classic.
I'm gonna give you a 30-second platform, but I don't want to steal all your thunder because I'm sure this is a post that's coming down later. But why do you think that, Alec?
Yeah, I made a post about it a while back, and it definitely like ruffled some feathers. But also like a lot of people agreed, and they're like, I've been thinking about that. Like people were saying, like I've been too scared to say that I felt this way too, right? Like there's people out there that are like, I don't know what the deal is with loaded carries. Like why does everyone love them so much? But like no one wants to be like, I don't really get it. I think they're kind of silly. But like aside from specific applications, like some people need to be good at loaded carries specifically. Like there's definitely applications for that, and especially for a lot of listeners on this podcast, like military, tactical athletes need to literally be able to carry heavy shit and have the grip strength to do so, et cetera, et cetera. So like you need to practice what you want to be able to do. So I'd say from like a sport practice or task specificity perspective, certain people should probably be doing farmers carries. But like when I see a personal trainer like working with a general population, like I don't know, like the classic Susan from accounting, like why the fuck is she doing farmers carries? Honestly, like of all the things that she could be doing in the gym to like actually get some more lean mass, like some a heavy leg press, or God forbid, like some actual cardio. Why is she like walking back and forth on the turf with the like 16 kilo kettlebells? I think it's the dumbest shit I've ever seen. It's so redundant. Like literally anything you could have Susan do in the gym is going to work her grip strength. The cardiovascular stimulus from that is pretty shitty compared to like just throwing her on an air bike for a couple sprints or something like that. To me, it's just like an extremely, extremely redundant stimulus. And someone will fire back and be like, well, it's super specific and like relevant for things that they do in their life, like, carrying laundry baskets and the grocery store and whatever.
Groceries.
I'm like, if you cannot get Susan strong enough to carry her fucking groceries with just a well-rounded program of like squats, deadlifts, pushes, pulls, whatever, then you aren't doing your job. Like you do not need to train her specifically for getting her groceries from the car to her house. Like that is not a specific training objective for everyday people. They need to put on lean mass, they need to do some cardio, they need to master the fundamentals, but there is no reason they need to be doing specific like loaded carries specifically. I think it's a waste of time. I think they're super overrated.
What I thought was funniest there is you talked about other people who are like afraid to voice an opinion like that. And it tells you a little bit about like the fitness industry and the fitness community and culture, that like there are like ideas that are dangerous to talk about, right? Like one, I've noticed this a lot recently, early in the page. And I think at the beginning, I attracted like a lot of strength coaches that I didn't expect up front. I expected mostly soldiers. And I used to routinely talk about, I guess I still talk about how periodization in the traditional sense is probably not as important as people act like it is.
Damn you.
And lately, like in the last probably year, nobody's really been bothered by me saying that. But in like the early days of the platform, there were people who would get furious at me. And like there's a non-zero number of people who have like cursed me out and then blocked me for like daring to suggest that like periodization might not be that big a deal for most people. And like it's crazy that certain things just have to like they like live on a pedestal where it's like not okay to take shots. It's so strange. I don't understand it.
Well, it was that, and then saying that tactical athletes were endurance athletes. That I don't want to say people got triggered necessarily, because that one seems to make more fundamental sense, but certainly a conversation starter. I love telling people that periodization is stupid, but I'll leave it at that because that's a whole different episode.
Yeah, the one I saw today was talking about how to program farmers carries for hypertrophy, and I was like, what? Like hypertrophy work is? I don't think that means what you think it means. But whatever.
Oh man. All right, let's leave this here because what I want to do is invite people who are listening to throw questions at Alex with an X on the Mops and Mo's page, and we'll do an FAQ and we'll bring Alec with a C back on if that suits everybody. Because these are fun.
Yeah, sounds awesome.
Cool.
Okay, so promise to the listeners, we'll throw up a link to the original episode we did with Alec. I know you kind of listed off all the places people can contact you. Sex and Zombies is going wild right now. That's Alec's program. You guys can find that on his Instagram. Alec, what is your Instagram?
Just my name at Alec Blenis.
Pretty basic.
It's easy.
Well, thanks again for coming on and shooting the shit with us.
Yeah, appreciate you guys. It was fun.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsandmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.